we're going to get started here. We're close to Resurrection Sunday, as we call it, where we recognize and remember how God raised Jesus from the dead, and what a history-changing moment that is. That is the biggest thing. It changed everything when he was raised from the dead. And so I wanted to be on topic with that, since it's a couple weeks away. Decided we'd take a look at substitution sacrifice this morning. Sacrifice is something that we don't do anymore. Kind of glad about that, actually, the way they did it in the Old Testament. But it's important for us to know some things about it, because it's so central to what God has accomplished through Jesus Christ, and how he brought about and brought to pass his plan, his rescue plan for people. And so we're going to take a look at substitution sacrifice, how it was introduced and how it kind of developed, and what he says about it in the Word. And then also the connection to Jesus Christ. There's really interesting connections in the Word as this story and concept develops that shows that Jesus Christ is indeed the sacrifice, the substitution sacrifice. So we're going to get started in Genesis here. Gotta get going here. And with Adam. Now, God told Adam and Eve to not do something specific, and yet they went ahead and did it. And they're about to get called out on it here in chapter 3, and they're not feeling too good about it. They heard the sound of Yahweh, God, walking around in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh, God, among the trees of the garden. Then Yahweh, God, called the man and said, Adam, where are you? Where are you at? He normally would be right there. And the man said, well, I heard the sound of you walking in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. He was feeling very vulnerable. He was naked, and he knew his nature had changed, and he knew that he had done wrong. And he probably also remembered this. A lot of times if we do something that's wrong behaviorally, we had rationalized why we shouldn't do it, and then we do it, and then all of a sudden it's very clear why we should not have done that. And what was I thinking? And he's probably having a moment like that too, because God said, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You must not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it, you will die. Yes, die. Very emphatic. And we know from Romans that the wages of sin is death. Sin brings death. It's the wage of sin. It's the outcome of death. But you know what? God did not do. He did not say to Adam, well, sorry, your life is over now. Sorry you made that choice. He didn't do that. Yahweh God made tunics of skin for Adam and for his wife and clothed them. And this was startling, because up to that point, life was a lot different with animals, and people weren't killing animals. There's only 2 people there, and animals weren't killing each other either, because everyone was a vegetarian. In chapter 1, God said, behold, I have given you every plant seeding forth seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree that bears fruit yielding seed, they will be food for you. And to every animal of the earth, to every bird of the heavens, to everything that creeps on the ground, and which is living soul, I've given every green plant for food. And it was so. So animals didn't need to be after other animals. People didn't need to be after animals. This was unusual. But here, God made tunics of skin for Adam and for his wife. Where did the skin come from? It came from an animal. That's where skin comes from. God sacrificed an innocent animal for skin, for tunics, for Adam and his wife. He covered them. And that is the introduction of substitution sacrifice. The innocent animal took on the problem from Adam and Eve and paid for it, and contributed then its skin for tunics so that they could be clothed and covered. And that's the beginning of it. Without shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. Well, the animal shed the blood and paid that price. Now, looking forward a little bit to Abel, at the end of the appointed days, Cain brought an offering to Yahweh from the fruit of the ground. Abel also brought some of the firstborn of his flock, even of their fat portions. Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering. Now, when it says the fat portion, something to remember, we kind of think of it in our time as, why did he give him the fat portion? But what it means in that time, biblically, it means the best parts. So Abel did not withhold any of the best parts. He gave it all. He brought some of the firstborn of his flock, even of their fat portions, the best parts. And it says the firstborn of his flock. Normally, it would be sheep that would be in a flock, right? Goats are in herds, I believe, but sheep would be in flocks. And the firstborn of his flock. And here we see a connection with Jesus, because in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, it says, because those whom he foreknew, he also decided in advance would be conformed to the image of his son, so that he, Jesus, would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Jesus was the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Adam sacrificed the firstborn of his flock. So kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come. There's that connection. We move forward now to Noah. This happens right after the ark is back on the ground. The flood is over. The waters have receded. The ground is now firm enough that they can get out of the ark and the exit. And Noah builds an altar to Yahweh, Genesis chapter 88, verse 20. And took of every clean animal, every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And it's interesting, this word altar, when we look at that and read about that, it starts popping up. This is actually the first usage of that word. And numbers in the Bible mean things. The number 1 means a new beginning. It indicates a new beginning. And certainly this was a new beginning. The entire world, the population of the world was snuffed out with water. The people and the animals, and only Noah and his family and the animals on the ark were the only ones left, and they were going to restart populating the earth and restart. So it was very much a new beginning. And this is the first time that word altar shows up. And that altar is sort of the connection point, the physical connection point that God and man interact, as we see going forward. Man can bring an offering and make a sacrifice on the altar, and if they bring it in the right way and do it the right way and come with the right heart, then God honors that, and the purpose of that sacrifice and offering can be fulfilled and be accomplished. And so there we have the first usage of the word altar. We also have the second usage in the same verse, and the number 2 indicates something is established. So we often think of Joseph. When Joseph was brought out of the prison to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, Pharaoh thought he had a couple dreams, and Joseph said, no, you had one dream. It was just repeated to you. It's twice, given to you twice, because the thing is established. And that's what that number 2 means. And when we look at a couple verses later, God says, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night will not cease. That is a promise of God that is not dependent on man at all, and says that's the way it's going to be. That is a promise, and that establishes the earth and the way it's going to be as long as the earth remains. And so that establishes our environment with God's promise, an unconditional promise. So that is established, and that's the right around those 2 words, or the altar showing up 2 times in those verses, which is very interesting, I think. Now we're going to fast forward to Abraham, and this is really an important prophetic action, really, or acting almost, of the sacrifice that Jesus is going to be giving of himself in the future. And I think very much it is a teaching moment for Jesus as well as us, but for Jesus as a young boy and learning to read and studying the scripture and so on, and coming to this and seeing prophetically what he is to do would really be helpful for him and be sobering too, I would think, at the same time. Genesis 22 verse 1 says, and after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Then he said, now take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go into the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you of. So we're going to unpack this verse a little bit, spend some time with it. First off, God tested Abraham. In a lot of versions, including the King James, it says God tempted Abraham. And it's important to know that the word nasa that's the Hebrew word that's translated testing or tempted, and it can mean either one. That word can mean testing or it can mean tempting, to tempt or to test. And that's true for the Greek word too. So to translate it properly requires understanding the motivation of the person who is doing the tempting or doing the testing. What is their purpose? Testing is done because generally to help someone to succeed at something. So we're tested in school maybe. So it's to help us build our knowledge, build our understanding, or build a skill, or become more capable at something. Testing in many circumstances in many ways is to help someone succeed, while on the other hand, to tempt someone is to try and get them to do something typically that they shouldn't be doing. So there's some kind of carrot out there that's attractive, so I'm going to go for it and then do something that's not right, and therefore I failed. So that's tempting, to cause failure. And certainly God's motivation is to strengthen the one that's being tested. He doesn't tempt anyone, he's testing people, and he's helping them to grow, to accomplish his purpose, to move his agenda forward. And that's what he's doing with Abraham in this verse, in this section. Now it says, your son, take your son, your only son whom you love. And of course, there's a strong connection there with Jesus. 1 John 4:9. This is how the love of God was revealed among us, that God has sent his only begotten son to the world so that we could live through him. His only begotten son. And in Abraham, your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac. So clearly a connection with Jesus, and Jesus would know who he was, and we certainly know who he was. Into the land of Moriah. That's where he wants Abraham to go, and to one of the mountains that I will tell you of. So the land of Moriah is an area, is a region, and it has multiple mountains. The mountain of Moriah is one of those mountains. The mountain of Moriah is where the temple is. Jerusalem and the temple's on Mount Moriah. But he doesn't say go to Mount Moriah. He says go to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains that I will tell you of. I don't think he told him to go to Mount Moriah. He went to the land, and then he's going to tell him which mountain. And I think it was the Mount of Olives, because this is a prophetic enactment of what is to come, a prophetic foreshadowing of what is going to be accomplished with Jesus and what he's going to experience and what's going to happen. And it's very true to fact in many ways. And if you've got your choice and you're going to do this enactment of it, and prophetic enactment, wouldn't you go? If you're going to have them travel and go to the right area, why wouldn't you pick the mountain that Jesus was actually going to be crucified on? And we believe that he was crucified on the Mount of Olives, and I'll show you why here in a second, one of the reasons why anyway. So let's develop this a little bit, this thought. Exodus 40 verse 6 is God instructing Moses and telling him how to set up the tabernacle. And he says, you are to set the altar of burnt offering in front of the entrance of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. So that altar is to be in front of the entrance. There's one entrance in. So here's a picture, a rendition of what that could have looked like. And get my mouse over here. There we go. This would be the tent of meeting, and that's typically where God is. That's his place. Here you have the altar in front. So there's an opening facing this way. There's only one opening in and out, and that's it. And right in front is the altar. So that's how it was to be set up. Okay. Now, fast forward to the time of Solomon. After David died, his father, he built an altar, built a temple, excuse me. He built the temple. And verse 12 of 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 12, then Solomon offered burnt offerings to Yahweh on the altar of Yahweh that he had built in front of the vestibule. Vestibule had the doorway, had the opening. So in front of that, he had built the altar of Yahweh. So he's carrying forward also with that same layout, the altar right in front of the opening. Now, that temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in the captivity of Babylon, and Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. After the captivity, they went back, some of them, some of Israel went back and rebuilt it. So they had to rebuild the temple. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the layout of the Temple of Solomon, where you can see that the offering is in front of the door of the temple. So looking out, you see the offering. Meant to show you that. But now that's torn down. It needs to be rebuilt. And Ezra chapter 3, verse 2 talks about that. It says, and Joshua, the son of Jozadak, stood up with his brothers, the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brothers, and built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. So they built it according to the law of Moses. And we already saw that the law of Moses had the altar in front of the opening or the entrance. Now we go forward to the temple of Herod, and he did a lot of remodeling when he came. He did a lot of building. And so this is the model, the scale model of Jerusalem and the temple that's at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And we visited that on the Bible Lands tour. And this is a picture. And what you're seeing here is Jerusalem. It's intended to show what it looked like at AD 66. So a few decades after Jesus, but probably pretty close to what it was when he was there. This is the temple area with the temple building inside there. And we're going to go look over the shoulders of these people next and look at the temple. There it is. We do a close-up. And the altar would be behind this gate. It would be just on the other side in that open area behind it. And that's where it was. And here's a diagram of that. You have that gate that we were just looking at. There's the altar, and here is the building. So looking out forward, you would be looking at the altar. Now, I say all that because it's important to understand that the temple is facing east, always faced east. And here is the temple inside. Oops. Here's the temple inside. That little dot is the temple, and then the building and the walls around it and the different courts. And it's looking east. This direction is east. And as you look east, this is Mount Moriah, and this structure is the Mount of Olives. So as you're looking east out of the temple, you're looking onto the Mount of Olives. You look right over top of the altar, keep on looking, you get to the Mount of Olives. And there's a road up there. It's extremely likely that that is where, in that area, is where Jesus was crucified. Because we know the Romans did crucify in that area, and we know that they crucified people along roadways because they wanted people to see them. It was a deterrent as well as a punishment. And that would be a very logical place for them to do it. And from the temple, you would be able to see the Christ being crucified, and Jesus would be able to see the temple. He would not be able to see the temple from over here, which is where tradition has him, at least one tradition has him being. There's no way you could see the temple from over there. But from here and up here, looking down, you'd have a good view of it. Here is a photo from actually the Tower of David, which is along the Western Wall. On our trip there on the Bible Lands tour, we were there, and I was taking this picture to get a view of this. This is the Temple Mount area, this whole area, and then the Dome of the Rock is there, and I'm looking northeast when I take this picture, so the direction east from this area would be kind of this direction. So up in here, somewhere up in here, wherever that road was at the time, would be the likely place that Jesus was crucified. And he would be able to look down and see the temple, and from the temple, indicating God's presence, would be looking out at him over the burnt offering. And so that from the temple, the burnt offering, the offering of Jesus Christ, could be seen. So back to Genesis 22, verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, took two of the young men with him, Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went to the place that God had told him of. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over there and bow and worship, then come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his own hand the fire and his knife, and the two of them walked on together. I think it's interesting that Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, put the wood on his son. His son had to carry the wood. Well, when Jesus was crucified, it was interesting in John 19, verse 16. So when Pilate then handed him, Jesus, over to them, the Romans, to be crucified, so they took Jesus away. And this was happening in the afternoon, so it was too late to start a crucifixion process on that day. So they led Jesus away, and that rest of the afternoon and overnight, they tortured him and beat him and humiliated him. And it was an awful, awful time. When the morning came, verse 17, and Jesus went out carrying his own cross, the wood. The wood was put on Isaac, his son, and the wood was carried by Jesus too. Now, when it says the cross, it's really the crossbeam of his cross, because that's how they crucified people. The vertical post was already in the ground, but the victim, or the criminal, the convicted person, was given a crossbeam that they would be attached to and then lifted up to be fixed, attached to the upright beam, the upright pole, and then they attach their feet too. So that's the piece that Jesus would have been carrying here, and he carried it as long as he could, and then someone else had to help him. But the wood was put on him, and I think that's interesting looking at Genesis as well, that connection. Verse 7, and Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Here's the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will himself see to providing the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they both went together, and off they went. And I want to point out that this is a burnt offering that's being talked about here. And that's an important distinction too. A burnt offering indicates complete submission to God's will. And we'll read about a part of it, at least, in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 4 through 9. Verse 4 says, and God is describing this burnt offering. It says he is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. Okay, so he, in this verse, is the person who is making the offering and performing, going to sacrifice something. So he has an animal, in this case a bull, and it's a perfectly fine bull, has no spot, no blemish, there's nothing wrong with it, it's innocent, it's never done anything wrong, it's just a wonderful animal, and it's his. And he brings that animal, and the person lays his hand on the head of the burnt offering, connecting to that animal, and it will be accepted for him to make atonement for him. He's going to pay the price. He's going to fix the wrong by paying the price for him. So with the hand on the head, making that connection, the innocence of the bull is transferred to the man, and the guilt and the problem of the man is transferred to the innocent bull, and then he is to kill the bull before Yahweh. And that's part of that sacrifice. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, are to approach with the blood, dash the blood against the sides of the altar, which is the entrance of the tent of meeting. He is to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And then it goes on to say how everything's burnt up. This is one of the offerings that there's nothing left to eat when it's done. It's all burnt because it indicates a complete submission to God, all in for God. I'm giving everything to God. That's the point of it. Here in Luke 22, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's in verse 41. And it says he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed. He knows what's coming. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knows what's coming. He knows what he's supposed to do. He's read this record in Genesis with Abraham and others. He knows what's about to happen to him. He knows what God wants him to do. But he says, verse 42, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, my will but yours be done. He doesn't want to do it. Who would? He knows what's coming is brutal. I don't want to do it, but I know that's what you want me to do. And if there's no other way, not my will, but yours be done. I'm all in. I'm willing to be that burnt offering. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, the first part of it says, he made him who did not know sin to be a sin offering on our behalf. He became that offering, but he did it by his free will, and he made it in a way that he was all in. He gave everything that he had. It does say they skin the burnt offering. And I think that's kind of interesting too. When you skin an animal, you keep the skin intact. Like if someone's making a bear rug, it's the whole bear rug. They don't cut it into pieces and give it to different people. No, it stays intact. And that's typically how an animal is skinned. In John 1:23, he's on the cross, and the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his clothes, divided them into 4 parts, a part for each soldier, and also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top down. So they didn't want to split it up because it's one piece, just like a skin is one piece. Isn't that interesting? There he has everything. Typically when they crucify someone, the Romans, they'd strip them down. They'd be naked. Usually they'd be completely naked. And I'm sure that's what was going on here. They've stripped him, he's clothed, there he is. And his tunic, though, was seamless, like the skin of an animal. In Genesis 3:21, Yahweh God made tunics of skin for Adam and for his wife and clothed them. Isn't that interesting? It talks about tunic being seamless, the skin of the burnt offering. God made tunics of skin for Adam and his wife to clothe them. And now Jesus is paying that price, and he has become unclothed, and his skin or tunic is there. I just think it's an interesting connection. And then after that, at some point, Mark 15, verse 37, Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. He died, he gave his life, and he had truly given everything and became that burnt offering by giving everything he had. Verse 9, Genesis 22, Adam and Isaac came to the place that God had told them of. Abraham built the altar there, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on the wood. And here in this verse, with Noah, we saw the first and second usage of the word altar. Here we have the 7th usage of the word altar. 7 is the number for perfection and completion. And prophetically, that was what Jesus was going to do. He was going to complete it and provide the perfect sacrifice on the altar. And here is the 8th usage of the word altar. And the 8 in the Bible means new beginning. And certainly this was a new beginning with Christ being that sacrifice and then God raising from the dead. Certainly a new beginning, wonderful new beginning. So I thought that was pretty interesting too. Coming back to God testing Abraham, it talks about that in Hebrews 11, starting in verse 17. By trust, Abraham, being tested, offered up Isaac. Yes, he who had gladly received the promises was offering up his only begotten son, even to whom it was said, in Isaac will your seed be called. Isaac, Abraham received many promises of God, but they all came to pass through Isaac. They had to be through Isaac's lineage also. And if Isaac's dead, no promises. They're not going to happen. Even the Messiah was going to come through that bloodline. So Isaac has to survive, yet God's asking him to sacrifice it. Well, Abraham reasoned that God was able to raise him up even out from among the dead, from which, as a parable, he did receive him back. So God stopped him at the last second, and he didn't kill Isaac, had a sacrifice with an animal instead, and but prophetically that showed how it was going to happen and what was going to happen. And Jesus indeed did die, but it showed that Jesus would be raised from the dead. 1 Corinthians 6:14, God raised the Lord and also will raise us up through his power, because he is our substitution sacrifice. He paid the price, and God raised him from the dead. Therefore, we also he will raise us up through his power. He raised the Lord, and he will also raise us up through his power. Now we're going to flip over to the Passover. Flip forward to Exodus chapter 12, after Abraham now, or many years later. Verse 1, Yahweh is going to talk to Moses and Aaron about the Passover and how it's done, or should be done. So he speaks to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt. So the Exodus hasn't happened. They're still in Egypt. They're about to leave, and they're going to get set up to leave and prepare. And this is what God wants them to do. Verse 2, this month will be the beginning of months for you. It will be the first month of the year for you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel and say, on the 10th day of this month, every man among them must take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. So a couple things here. Excuse me. This month will be the beginning of months, the first month of the year for you. Up to this point in time, the month called Tishri was the first month of the year. For us in our calendar, the first month of the year is January. January 1st starts the new year, and the day before is the last day of the prior year. Well, up to this point, Tishri 1, the first day of Tishri, was the first day of the new year. And the month of Tishri typically starts in our September, so it's in the fall. And God is saying, okay, I know that's the way it's been, but this month that we're in right now, is going to be the new first month of the year going forward. The month that was at that time that they were living in right then was the month of Nisan. So Nisan is now the first month of the year, and Tishri is the 7th. So 6 years after the first month is Tishri. And to this day, Tishri is still the beginning of, you could call it the secular calendar or the administrative calendar, and there's things that happen because of that. But also, it's also an important month because of so many the feasts happen in that month. But then the month of Nisan is the first month, and that typically begins in our month of March. So now, and it's going to be the first month of the year, and this would be called the sacred calendar. So in Nisan, on the 10th day of that month, every man among them must take a lamb. You select the lamb, pick it out for the sacrifice that's going to happen a little bit later. In Matthew 21, verse 1, talks about Jesus and his entourage approaching Jerusalem for the Passover, and this is the Passover at which he will be sacrificed. In verse 1, when they drew near Jerusalem, came to Bethphage and the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and her colt with her. Untie them, bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, say, the Lord has need of them, and he will immediately send them back here. So I'm just going to borrow them. But this took place with the result that what was spoken through the prophet was fulfilled, saying, tell the daughter Zion, look, your king comes to you meek, riding on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So this was prophecy that people knew, and this is what the Messiah was going to do. So if this were to happen, this would be a sign that this is the Messiah. The Messiah has finally come. This is a really, really big deal. And the disciples went and did just as Jesus directed them, brought the donkey or colt, put their outer garments on them, and he sat on them. And most of the crowd spread their outer garments on the road. They saw him coming. Others were cutting branches from the trees, were spreading them on the road, and the crowd that went in front of him and those who followed after were crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David. The Son of David's the Messiah. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna, he's here. It's the King. He's come. He's fulfilling the prophecy. Here he comes. And when he had entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred, saying, Who is this? Who is this? And the crowds were saying, This is Jesus. This is the prophet Jesus, the one from Nazareth of Galilee, the one we've been hearing. He's here. He's the Son of David. He's here. He fulfilled the prophecy. A lot of excitement. Well, this happens on the day of selecting the lamb for that Passover. That's when it happened. And so here's God selecting the lamb, his lamb, the lamb, in front of all the people, and they're celebrating that. And how cool is that? How that coincides with what he says and instructs them in Exodus chapter 12. And that lamb in verse 5, that lamb you select, it must be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you are to keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will kill it at evening. Then they must take some of the blood, put it on the 2 doorposts, and on the lintel of the houses in which they will eat it. So, the 14th day of the same month, they selected on the 10th of that month, they sacrifice it, they keep it until the 14th day of the month, and that's when the congregation of Israel will kill it. All the people will sacrifice their lamb that they selected on the 10th, they'll sacrifice it on the 14th at evening. Now, this is important to understand too. Our day starts at midnight. Midnight is the beginning of the next day and the end of the prior day. But for the Hebrew calendar in biblical times and still, evening, the sunset is when the day starts, the new day starts, and the old day ends at sunset. So it was important that that's understood, because the next day, the sacrifice happens on the 14th, but the 15th, the following day, which starts at sunset, is the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it starts with a special holy day. It's like a Sabbath, special Sabbath. You can't do any work, can't do any preparation. It's got to be all done. So this sacrifice that they're doing on the 14th has to be done in time so that they can sacrifice the lamb, then they can prepare it, and they can prepare the meal that they're going to be eating and have everything all set and done by sunset, because they can't do it after sunset because it's a holy day, a special holy day. So the way they handle that is they would sacrifice their lamb at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so that they would have enough time to prepare the meal, cook it, prepare the meal, and have everything all set by sunset when the 15th began. And that's the timing of it. So in Luke chapter 23, we see the connection to Jesus. He's on the cross, verse 44. It was now about the 6th hour. The 6th hour is noon, 12 o'clock noon. It's about 6th hour, 12 o'clock noon, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. The 9th hour is 3 in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when the Passover lambs are being sacrificed. So at 3 o'clock, because the sun's light failed and the veil of the sanctuary was torn down the middle, and Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. He died at exactly the right time, right when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed. That's when he gave up his life, because he was the Passover lamb. He was the sacrifice, the substitution sacrifice. Isn't that something? That's just really special. And then after that, he died, and they wanted to take care of the victims there. In John 19:34, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. They were surprised he was dead already. They pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. He was all in. You know, blood stands for life too, the life of the person. He gave his life completely, and the blood also. So that was Jesus, our sacrifice. Now, what we have read in Exodus 12 to this point was God explaining things to Moses and Abraham, and now Moses is sharing that information with the elders of Israel and telling them how it's supposed to work. Verse 21, then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, draw out, take lambs according to your families and kill the Passover. You're to take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you is to go out of the door of his house until the morning. Stay inside. It's really important, guys. Put that blood on the doorpost, but don't go outside until the morning, for Yahweh will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. It is not God that is killing the people. It is the destroyer, the spirit of destruction, the spirit of death, an evil spirit that is going in, and he wants to destroy. He wants to kill. That's his nature. And so all the Egyptian houses, none of them have blood on them. So the firstborn dies, and the firstborn of the animals die. He gets to Israel, and that's what he really wants. But when there's a house with the blood on the lintel, as instructed, everyone's inside, God doesn't let them go in. He keeps them out. God protects them. He keeps them from getting struck. That's what God does at the Passover. The spirit of death passes over because God is protecting. And looking at that verse a little bit closer, Yahweh will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to strike you. In Romans 3:25, first part says, whom God set forth as an atoning sacrifice through trust in his blood. That's referring to Jesus. He's the atonement. He's paid the price for our shortcoming. He's completely paid for it. We trust in his blood. We trust in what he's done. We trust in it. Then 2 Thessalonians 3:3, but the Lord is faithful, who will establish you and guard you from the wicked one. He wouldn't let the evil one come into the house of the Israelites in the Passover, and he guards us from the wicked one. Colossians 1:13, he rescued us from the authority of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. So our citizenship is in Christ's kingdom, but his kingdom is not here yet, is it? This is an evil world that we live in, an evil kingdom. We're ambassadors from where our citizenship is, which is with Christ. But the king isn't here, so his kingdom isn't here. We're here as his ambassadors. And he has rescued us from that darkness, from the authority of that darkness, and gave us the citizenship in that kingdom, Christ's kingdom. 2 Corinthians 1:10, who rescued us out of so great a death and will rescue. We have set our hope on him that he will rescue us yet again. That's right. Christ is going to return, and if we have passed away by that time, he's going to get us back up, and we will not experience the second death. And if we're still alive when he comes back, he's going to transform us, and we're going to be like him, and we will not experience the second death. He will rescue us yet again. Hebrews 10:10 says, we have been made holy through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. It's done. So that's why Romans chapter 12, 1-2 says, if we think about all these things that were accomplished through that sacrifice, all the things that Jesus did, all the things that God did, the things that he's shown us in the Bible that we can learn about and understand the significance of all these things. Therefore, verse 1, I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as sacrifice, living, holy, pleasing to God. That's the way we should live. He's not asking us to die for somebody. That could happen, but that's not what he's asking for. It's a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service. It's logical that we would react that way. Out of gratitude and recognition of what's been done for us, I want to live my life in recognition of that. I want to live for my God. I want to live for my Lord. living holy and pleasing to God. That's a logical service. It's also my spiritual responsibility. He's put his gift, Holy Spirit, in me. I operate and you operate in a spiritual battle. So my spiritual duty and responsibility would be to live that way, holy and pleasing to God. And not to be conformed to the pattern of this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. To remember God's word, to be inspired by it, to understand and to have a relationship with God, so that you can test and approve what the will of God is, what is good and pleasing and perfect. And there's so many ways we can provide service, our reasonable service. We can pray for people, we can comfort people, we can cry with people, we can laugh with people, we can help them through their life, we can teach them, we can inspire them. So many things that we can do in so many ways. Be an example, being a shining light for God by living our life in the way as pleasing to him. So many ways, and that's service, and that is reasonable, and that is living holy and pleasing to God. So thank you for spending the time and listening to this, and I hope that you find it helpful.